the next one was offering, and the reading there is 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 6. I don't know how much picture, but if that's the way they slaughtered the animals, I sure wouldn't want to be the person down there holding the bull. One slight slip, and the sacrifice might not be the bull. Um, and then the next part was conscience, where we left off last time with the reading 1 Corinthians 8, 7 through 13. All right, thank you. So we talked about the difference between the new Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians, and that the Jewish Christians for many years, of course, had been taught about the evils of idolatry, and at this stage in their in the history of Israel, they were quite aware of that, and had been far removed from idol worship for quite some time. We will see in the next lesson that that was not always the case. But at this time they were. And so it was so deeply ingrained in them that we talked about that particular painting there. And again, what is that? What does that represent? Paul's vision of the sheet let down from heaven containing the animals. And he was told to kill and eat. And he said, whatever you say. No, he didn't. What did he say? Yeah, I'm not going to eat anything that's unclean. And God said, as we've said, don't you dare call anything that I call clean unclean. Okay, and so a very direct um, message to Peter. So, um, as we said, then some of the new Christians who had matured more quickly readily accepted the fact that the idols were merely man-made artifacts, and Therefore, meat offered to them was no different than any other meat, actually, and had no religious significance. So they didn't have any problems eating the meat, that whether it had been offered to idols or not. But those others had views that, well, we're going to offend um, and displease people if we ate food offered to a false god, even if that god did not really exist. And so these people also thought that, well, the setting doesn't really matter either, where we eat the food, even if it's right in the idol's temple. So others of them were totally hesitant to partake of such meat because they felt that consuming it demonstrated the fact that they agreed with the sacrifice. Um, and they they were not they were really concerned about the possibility of eating meat offered to idols. So we said last time, um, what are some of the unclean animals? The pig is the one that we think of first, but also in that uh, painting there are many other animals. Remember, it talked about cloven hoofs and whether or not they eat cuds and so on. Um, and so we see snakes and kangaroos. I don't think that Peter would have encountered any kangaroos because I don't believe that the apostles traveled to Australia. But um, elephants, tigers, snakes, dogs, dogs, and birds that were predatory. Sorry, Carl, what were you saying? Um, that is included in Levitical law, that fish without scales, which would include what kind of fish? Catfish, sturgeon, no carp has scales. Eels. Why do you suppose that catfish and sturgeon were prohibited? Yes, yes, they do. And so that's likely the reason that they're included. And nevertheless, God is now saying to Peter that anything that I say is clean is clean. All right. So um, there are many passages in the New Testament that would suggest that the dietary laws were completely done away with, and that's what we believe, although there are some people who still continue to believe that these kinds of things are prohibited. Um, According to the companion, then, the differences between the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians are led to problems of understanding. And so Paul used the word meat in two different ways when he's writing to the Corinthians. Sometimes he was writing about the Jewish dietary laws, and he refers specifically to meat that was prohibited to the Jews according to the Mosaic law. Um, there was no reason why Gentile Christians or even Jewish Christians at this stage, should not eat pork or the other animals that God had told Peter that he should kill and eat. But some of the Jewish Christians just could not bring themselves to do so. They still had lingering concerns about the law. And of course, dietary law was not the only thing they had lingering things about. There are many other carryovers from the Jewish law that some wanted to impose on all Christians. One of the most prominent one being one that Paul talked about on his journeys with regard to Timothy and some others of the followers was with regard to what? Circumcision, right. So neither group then, according to Paul, was to impose their views on the other group. Okay, these are matters of opinion, not matters anymore of religious significance. Paul then said that neither group was to look down on those who disagreed with them. Okay? So, no, you can't compel them to agree with you, but you should not look down on them because they don't. All right? And he said something similar to that in Romans 14, 1 through 3, if someone would read that for us, please. All right. And of course, in our society today, we have people who don't believe in eating meat. Uh, and they tend to be fairly aggressive with regard to people who do eat meat. Well, Paul is saying that's not right. If people want to eat meat, fine. If they don't want to eat meat, fine. But don't go around uh, um, calling people that eat meat butchers or I don't know what you call vegans other than malnourished. But that's see, there's a bias there, and of course, vegans aren't necessarily malnourished, but they could be, depending on what they eat. They have to be wise in their choice. We'll ask our nurse. That's right, isn't it? So they have to make sure they get the protein that they need from other sources. Um, okay, so going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, um, it includes a caveat regarding eating meat that may have been sacrificed to idols. And that's um, included in verses 9 through 13. Um, quickly look over that. What is the caveat with regard to eating meat? Right. So if eating the meat is going to cause a weaker brother, in quotation marks, uh, violate their conscience, then we should not flaunt the eating of meat in front of them. And Paul even goes to the extent to say that he would abstain completely from eating meat if there was a brother that was offended by his meat eating. Um, moving on to the idea of eating the meat in the courtyard of the idol's temple, Some um, of the folks thought that that was perfectly fine. But how does eating meat in the courtyard of an idol differ from eating meat in the privacy of someone's home? Yes, that's exactly right. Um, and he talks in First Corinthians chapter 10, verses 25 to 30, about this further. So let's take a look at that. First Corinthians chapter 10, verses 25 through 30. All right, thank you very much. So um, the point here is very definitely that if you buy meat in the marketplace, don't look for the label that said "sacrifice to." Um, or if you go to a home of a friend who is an idol worshiper, don't say, "Hey, was this offered to?" You eat what's set before you without asking questions. That's very similar in an analogy that I've used before when we have annual meetings of the congregation. The government of Ontario requires the church to be incorporated and to have a certain percentage of the members present at the annual meeting. Um, now, there's a certain that certain percentage, of course, is called a quorum. And the laws, parliamentary laws, say that if there are no questions asked, a quorum is presumed to be present. So you know as well as I do that annual meetings are not exactly the most popular gathering places. And so you don't stand up in front of the group and say, "Hey, do we have a quorum?" And then, "No, we don't." So that's an analogous situation here. Okay. Um, so eat what they give you and don't ask questions. Hey, does that seem like a cop out to you? exactly. Okay, so it can't be a cop out because Paul's telling them that's what to do. We just have to be judicious, um, and we have to not dig too deeply into things that might cause difficulties. All right. Um, Foundations. First Corinthians then says um, that we are. Well, I forgot to show you this picture before. It's just to show you to eat whatever's set before you, um, and that looks mighty delicious, doesn't it? Um, yeah, you can see there's ham there on the table, so that's part of this feast. So foundations, First Corinthians states, despite there being no religious significance to eating meat offered to idols, Paul urged the Corinthians to exercise uh, conscience, caution rather. The companion says, Paul has already emphasized that knowledge, important though it might be, does not supersede love. It remained it remained for him to illustrate how reliance on knowledge could overshadow love. Um, Christians who relied on knowledge to justify the eating of meat offered to idols did so at the expense of showing love to their brothers and sisters. So, this balance between knowledge and love is extremely important. Knowledge doesn't trump love. Does love trump knowledge? Okay, so neither trumps the other, right? There has to be this balance. All right, so the question was not could a Christian eat meat offered to an idol? It was should a Christian eat meat offered to an idol? If the action caused weaker members to stumble, it was to be avoided. The cause of Christ is more important than personal preferences. Love for others must drive our behavior. We would do well to remember that all individual Christians are at different stages of spiritual growth. We must not assume that others possess a similar level of understanding to ourselves. Instead, we must engage in actions designed to build up rather than destroy the faith of those we encounter. It is never wrong to review the basics of Christianity, of course. At the same time, we must strive to progress beyond the elementary principles of the faith. And we talked about this last week or the week before about the difference between eating meat and still drinking the milk of the infant. But no matter what level of understanding one possesses, we must always treat others with charity. Um, any questions or comments? individuals traveling to other countries and going into the homes of people of a totally different culture. And the person offers them food, and they say, "No, thank you." That is an extreme insult. Is that correct in some societies? Yes, it is. So, what do we do under those circumstances? Um, I took some of my students to a Salina intermediate school in Dearborn, which is 98% Yemeni Muslim. And the last day that the students were there, they brought food for a meal. And one of the things was raw beef. And so I don't particularly want to eat raw beef, but I'm not going to say, "No, thank you." I will take a small amount, and you see what I'm saying? You 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 can't insult people in that way and then expect to have a relationship with them. Do you agree, or uh, can you pretend to eat it? No, but it happens. It does happen. Okay, and there's always and I'm not saying that you should lie to the person, but there's always the issue of allergies, right? So that if you are allergic to something, you're certainly not going to taste it or try it. We know how hyperallergic some people are. Just the very um, odor of peanuts, for example, will cause some people to go into anaphylactic shock. Um, so yeah, that is a very definite factor. Any other thoughts or comments? All right then. Thank you very much. Um, we our next lesson. Um, I'm not going to give out the papers just yet. We'll save them for next time. But I will just show you, as usual, the focus questions. Um, Next, we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13, and we'll be talking about history. And part of this relates to what we've just been talking about, and idol worship with regard to the history of the Jews. We say that the Jews were monotheistic, um, but that's debatable during certain parts of their history, during the times of their wandering in the wilderness, for example, or during the times when the kings, David and Solomon in particular, married wives from many different backgrounds. And they accommodated, at least Solomon did, accommodated those wives by involving themselves in worship of some of these foreign gods. So it wasn't always true that the Jews were strict monotheistic worshipers, and that is very important. Why did Paul mention the specific sins that are listed in the text, which we will see next time? And how does God's ability to deliver the Israelites from the Egyptians illustrate his ability to deliver us from temptation? And what's the main lesson? So the reading for next time, as I said, is 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13. So if someone would read that for us now, please, we will have that before us to think about.